Our speaker for this session is Bruce Ballenger. Dr. Ballinger is a professor of English and former department chair at Boise State University, specializing in composition theory, inquiry-based learning, and creative nonfiction. He is the author of 7 books, including the best-selling textbooks through Pearson, The Curious Writer, and The Curious Researcher. He's published more than 30 articles and essays in publications ranging from River Teeth, a Journal of Narrative Nonfiction, to College English. His new book, Crafting Truth, Short Studies in Creative Nonfiction, was published last year. His session today is entitled Overcoming Resistance to Reflection in Creative Nonfiction. Bruce, are you ready to begin?
I just got unmuted, so I think I am ready. Can you hear me?
All right, thanks so much. We got you.
Okay, great. Let me just get things going here. All right, well, I want to thank Pearson for this opportunity to talk to my colleagues across the country about creative nonfiction. I listened into the previous presentation and it seemed really, really great, and so I'm excited to be able to participate in this, and in particular talk about a subject that is something I feel really strongly about and is a central concern of mine, not just in the creative nonfiction classroom, the advanced writing classroom, in the MFA classroom, but also in composition. So I think one of the things I want to point out at the very start is that my intention here is to address some challenges that we have with writing students that range from composition to MFA creative nonfiction students. And I teach all of those, and I think some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today apply to all of those students. And I'm as interested in the application in composition as I am in creative nonfiction classes. So today I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a lot about overcoming resistance to reflection in creative nonfiction, and I want to try to be clear about what it is that I mean by that. Creative nonfiction, you know, when my students, when they start, the novice students, when they start writing creative nonfiction, or my fiction students in the MFA program who have not much experience with creative nonfiction, generally think that writing a piece, an essay, is essentially getting the story right, telling a really good story. Some of the same kinds of challenges that fiction writers face. And so they tend to focus pretty exclusively, especially in early drafts, on what happened, trying to describe artfully through scene-by-scene construction and description, dialogue, all those literary conventions that creative nonfiction has borrowed from fiction, to create a world that the reader can enter about that captures what happened in their experience. And of course, this is an essential element of any kind of literary effort. What they tend to not realize or choose to ignore or resist is the idea that nonfiction really, and the essay in particular, usually has 2 narratives. The first narrative, of course, is the narrative of what happened, and the second narrative is the narrative of thought, the reflection by the narrator of what happens or what it means, what significance the writer attaches to what happened from the vantage point of the present. And this is discussed extensively in both theorists of the essay like Philip Lopate, but as well as practitioners of the essay like Vivian Gornick, in a whole range of ways. Vivian Gornick talks about the difference between the situation and the story in her fine, rather short book about that. And essentially, the distinction she's making with those terms is much the one that I'm making. The situation is perhaps a grandfather died, and at the funeral there was a dramatic moment in which some relatives got into an argument, and that's the situation. But the story is essentially, what does that mean? Why is it important? What's significant about that? What does the writer see now looking back at that situation and understand that he or she didn't understand then? The situation and story distinction is helpful, but I think there's a number of others that I'll just throw out there for you to think about that your students may find even more helpful, and I can tell you which ones my students like. Philip Lopate in his really fine piece that looks at this issue talks about the protagonist and the narrator. And one of the things that's really interesting about, I think, this distinction is that it's a very practical moment in a creative nonfiction workshop or class in which we're discussing a student's work. And the practical dilemma is, what do we call the narrator? If Bill wrote the essay, do we say, well, in this part of the essay when Bill talks about the conflict at the funeral? Or do we say, when the narrator talks about that conflict at the funeral, he says? And so as I've thought more and more about this, I've gravitated more and more towards describing the writer in the workshop as the narrator, not by name. In some ways, that's a separate issue that we can talk about maybe some other time, the persona in creative nonfiction. But I think Eileen Pollock, I think she's the one who came up with this, makes the distinction between the then and the now narrator. And this my students find enormously helpful. The then narrator essentially describes what happened. The now narrator is the one who tries to make some sense of it. And what's great about this is that I think it captures the key distinction between narrative and reflection, which has to do with time. And then Tom Newkirk, a mentor and friend of mine, talks about the reflective turn in an essay. We can also talk about the difference between the dramatic narrative, again, what happened, and the narrative of thought, the story of what the now narrator makes of what happened. And then, generally speaking, we're also talking about the distinction between narrative and exposition. Exposition, or reflection, tends to be more expository language that tends to be slightly more general, and narrative is just concrete and detailed, scene description, things like that. Now, here's the thing that I found interesting about this, and I can explain this to my students, and it makes sense to them, from comp students up to the MFA students. But what I find is that sometimes the most experienced writers, the ones that I get taking my creative nonfiction class in our MFA program, are most resistant to the idea that the now narrator should interfere with the story. Now, Philip Lopate, in a really fine article on the subject, talks specifically about this. Let me just see. I just skipped by a slide that I wanted to share with you, but I'm not seeing it. But I'm going to find it. Here we go. Is that it? Yeah. This slide should have come earlier because I think it's relevant now. In his piece, Reflection and Introspection, and by the way, I think Philip Lopate is probably the finest theorist of the essay, the personal essay that we have around, and I encourage you to look at the many essays that he's written on the writing of the essay. But he had the same experience that I did, which was that students, including his graduate students, resisted this idea that they should essentially add intellectual content to their personal essays. And then he writes about this, I think, in a pretty strong way, to put it mildly. Could it be, I wondered, that my students had a narcissistic attachment to that ignorant younger self, so fragile, so guileless, and wanted to protect it from the contamination of intellectual sophistication? I'm not quite sure I'd say this strongly, but I understand the phenomenon, which is that even with experienced writers, there's this sense that the introduction of reflection or exposition in a story will ruin it, and that it's pretty much beside the point. And that's what I'd like to talk about, sort of the nature of that resistance. Some of the resistance is literary. And and again, I'm talking specifically about creative nonfiction students. I'm going to talk about composition students somewhat a little later, because of course in many composition classes they're also writing personal narratives, they're writing personal essays. But the literary objections my students, my creative nonfiction students often raise, usually begin with the old chestnut that you're supposed to show and not tell. Now, of course, this is generally good advice for any literary writer, any creative writer. In a sense, depending on what we mean by it, it's good advice for any writer, period. But this idea has been so impressed on creative writing students that they embrace it and they carry it into their nonfiction work. And the problem, of course, is that it doesn't necessarily apply to nonfiction. In fact, that nonfiction both shows and tells. Part of this is resistance as well, is that the real question that particularly my fiction writers bring into my creative nonfiction class is to what do we have the strongest obligation as writers in writing creative nonfiction, the story or reality? Now, each implies a very different way of approaching the work. The fiction writers, from their training, essentially believe quite strongly that it's getting the story to work that's most important, and all of their creative and imaginative attention tends to be on dramatic narrative. If our obligation is to reality, then we are going to work with much more effort at trying to understand accurately what happened and trying to be honest and truthful in our understanding of what happened from this distance. And I think, again, finally, the other literary objection has to do with the celebration of ambiguity in the implicit nature of most literary texts. You know, that why should I tell the reader what to think? It should be implicit in the story I'm telling. And of course, there is, even in creative nonfiction, a tremendous amount that is implicit. But also being explicit, saying what you mean, is a feature that can go right along with that. And I think part of it, I think creative nonfiction writers generally have a much stronger intention to say what they mean, to be explicit. So there's also some practical objections that students have from comp to creative writing MFA students. First of all, there's a real reluctance to add reflection to a narrative because they feel like it's stating the obvious, which is related to the whole issue I just mentioned. If it's implied, why do I have to say it? My less experienced writers often say, well, I don't know what I think. You know, how can I say what I think when I don't know what that is? And of course, that is a very real dilemma. That the challenge of the essay in particular is to use the process as a way of generating insight. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do. And it's something that I think as creative writing teachers we're in creative nonfiction responsible for doing. I think the other issue is placement. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And I would say number 5 is something that's also interested me, and I think is, and this is a quotation from Lopate's article, it's something that interests him as well, and that is that there seems to be a tendency among undergraduate and graduate students in creative writing classes to value emotion over intellect, that somehow the insertion of the narrator's ideas about things or struggle to come to some understanding about things is far less valuable and important than trying to create work that has emotional impact. Now, of course, it's a binary that isn't a binary. You know, that good narratives, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, both have emotional power, but they're also about ideas. My fiction writer friends would never say that their work is not about working through some idea about the world. It's just that that work tends not to be visible in a in a short story. And in a personal essay, that's part of the drama, is a writer trying to come to terms with understanding something. But I want to talk about the whole placement issue a little bit, because I think it's really interesting for those of us who both read and write nonfiction, literary nonfiction. Because I think one of the things we can help our students do is begin to recognize the patterns of reflection, where it occurs, and to look for it in the essays that we assign to them and the essays that they read on their own. And I think this applies to memoir equally well. So first I want to talk a little bit, I want to go back to my English 101 and 102 students, because I think the ways that they struggle with reflection is, because they're less experienced writers, is really interesting and worth taking a look at, and certainly I hope what I'm about to talk about will be helpful to those of us, and I assume there's quite a few out there who teach personal narratives in first-year writing classes. The patterns that I see of reflection in student writing, particularly with very inexperienced writers, is the most common is once a student, I challenge a student to sort of to use the personal narrative as an opportunity to think about something. In other words, to add some reflection. The tendency in the next draft is to create something that looks like this, and that is that the narrative from the first draft is largely unchanged, but tacked at the end would be what I would call a eureka paragraph, in which may begin with, as I look back on this now, I realize that true friends are hard to find. Tends to be a kind of general idea, usually a cultural commonplace that's just been tacked on at the end that does seem to apply to the story. So what's interesting, and this of course is a very understandable and logical thing to do. What's missing here, of course, is the ways in which reflection should be inspired by the story itself, that they're deeply connected. And the best way of talking about this, I think, is to, or a helpful way, is to talk about the convention that since that television program, The Wonder Years, started some time ago, the convention of having dual narrators in television dramas. I love the Wonder Years example, although there are many more contemporary ones, because what made that show, I think, powerful was that the now and the then narrators were active in the story from the very beginning. So we have both Kevin's experience of what happened and then the adult narrator's commentary on what it meant, what it might mean, what he understands it to mean now from beginning to end. And these are the kinds of moves that we want students to make as well. Now, as they improve, or as they struggle with this, one alternative is that they often shift to this kind of thesis example model. I see this a little less often, but this is also based on a less experienced student's background in writing, a logical response to the urge to reflect in a personal essay. And then finally, I think sometimes you get students who tell a story and then insert some block of exposition, of reflection, tends to be general, somewhere in the middle or in several other blocks. But it doesn't seem integral to the story. There doesn't seem to be a relationship between the telling of the story and the writer's current understanding of what it means. Now, I think it's really helpful to look at published essays as we instruct students about how this might work, and particularly placement. And those of you who teach creative nonfiction or literary essays, I think, can help students understand how to be good readers of these essays by alerting them to very kind of subtle movement in the essay that is that narrative of thought and dramatic narrative, and the ways in which those two things are woven together artfully, and which both create a kind of movement in the piece itself. Now, I often use George Orwell's essay, A Hanging, widely anthologized, very easy to find online, as an introduction to this idea, because it's so obvious when the piece moves from narrative to exposition, from what happened to what happens. And it occurs right in the middle of the essay. And I'm going to show you another way of looking at this in a second, but more visual way. But those of you who know the essay might remember this. But you know, it's an essay that describes a hanging, obviously. I believe it was in Burma, and the narrator, which is Orwell, tends to simply, from the beginning until the very middle, simply describe what's happening. And there's this moment as the condemned man is moving towards the gallows, that Orwell has him step slightly aside to avoid a puddle on the path. Really powerful emotional moment. Here's a condemned man who steps aside to avoid a puddle. And then the very next line is, "It is curious, but till that moment I'd never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man." You can see the shift in language immediately. And what we see here is this movement into reflection, into a different kind of language, into a different way of thinking. The movement from telling what happened to explaining what it might mean, what the writer now understands it to mean. Very obvious, students see it immediately. But this isn't simple. You know, here's a piece that I discussed in my class the other day, one of my favorite Joan Didion's essays, Dreamers of the Golden Dream, a just artful piece about Lucille Miller, who burned her husband alive in a Volkswagen, a piece that was written, I believe, in 1964 or so. And it's a powerful work of cultural criticism. It's also a really remarkable essay, and I think one of the things that I love about this essay is the ways in which Didion, in all of her pieces, and especially this one, moves to reflect. And you can see by the yellowed portions that movement occurs within a passage. You know, it's not a separate paragraph. It's not. It's closely woven into the story itself. And so my more advanced students, I want to encourage them to look at the ways in which reflection can be deeply embedded in the story. And then, in fact, it should be, because our ideas about the meaning of things are always connected to the specifics of what happened. And when they're not, they tend either not to be truthful, or they tend to be general and lacking in insight. Look at one more. We also read that night, and that's why I'm sharing this, Virginia Woolf's wonderful essay, Street Haunting. And once again, you can see that here's a writer who is very interested in reflection, who in fact, at least in her nonfiction, and this essay in particular, is much less interested in dramatic narrative than she is in her narrative of thought. And you can see actually how the reflective passages dominate. Now, here's another way of thinking about this, and here's, for those of you who teach reading of essays, here's a way of alerting your students to this other narrative. One way of imagining this is that the movement of the essay is not just, of course, dramatic narrative, but this narrative of thought, and that it's triggered by a shift in language, so that you could theoretically at least graph an essay and demonstrate that movement. So the piece that I just shared with you, 10 paragraphs in, of course, in Orwell's essay, we have this movement to reflect. The level of abstraction shoots up, and then he plunges back into the narrative, and then it goes on past 11 paragraphs. Here's I guess I made a slide of a more mathematical representation. Of course, this is all really very crude, and I'm overstating to some extent the accuracy. I would hesitate to do that, but you can get the general idea. Here's Dreamers of the Golden Dream, and I think this is very typical of Didion's work. She is very interested in ideas, and the intellectual content of her pieces is very important. She's also a great storyteller, and so you have this constant movement back and forth, and I think that's one of the dramas of her essays. Here's a Lewis Thomas essay, and I would say he tends to work at a lower level of specificity and abstraction, but I mean, that's all arguable. But this becomes a really interesting method of talking about this and visualizing how it works. So I want to shift, and I want to make sure that we have time to talk about this if there are any questions. But I want to shift a little bit to talking about how we deal with overcoming this resistance in the classroom and how we might talk about it. I've already implied a number of approaches that I use, including sharing essays and published essays by writers that students and I admire, and trying to detect this movement, trying to recognize when and where creative nonfiction writers, memoirists and essayists in particular, move to comment, move to reflect on the narrative. And this is always a really interesting discussion. Students tend to like it. It's the danger, of course, is that it's too simplified. That we, I think we have to warn students that reflection is not an easy term to define. And in fact, I would argue that reflection typically is a shift in language from very specific concrete language to slightly more or a lot more general abstract language. But I also say that things like metaphor is a kind of reflection. The comparison of two unlike things is really a very intellectual act. And the kind of approach I have used up until now, described up until now today, is I think would tend to overlook that. And so I think we want to try, whenever we talk about this, to suggest how complex it is. But, we're academics. We always make things complex. Anyway, I think teaching-wise, the way I campaign to overcome this resistance begins with a conversation that I have with students about why abstraction is a good thing. And there's a lot of ways that you can talk about this. And there's some real dangers in talking about it as well. The most obvious danger, of course, is that we often do get abstract writing from our students. We often, including narrative writing, we often do tell them in their nonfiction narratives to do more showing and less telling. So there's a danger then, of course, that what we do is we encourage them to get farther and farther away from the details of their experience, the data from which ideas come from, and live only in this kind of world of general ideas, which oftentimes, again, kind of rests on cliche and cultural commonplaces. True friends are hard to find, things like that. But I want my students to also understand that when they use more abstract language, they're doing a different kind of thinking. And I think this was best articulated by a literary theorist, Richard Oman, some years ago, when he talked about Elements of Style, the great book by E.B. White and William Strunk, and its admonition to use specific and concrete language. And Oman in this piece talks about the ways in which that advice was adopted largely by writing textbooks, and certainly has become part of our mantra in most creative writing classes. There is power in the detail, and of course there is. But this is what he says: the injunction to use detail, to be specific, to be concrete, pushes the student writer towards a language that most nearly reproduces immediate experience, and away from a language that might be used to understand it, to transform it, relate it to something else. So one of the things that happens that when students take our advice, Ullman suggests, and focus on the specific and the concrete, is that they use the language that's available to them to actually make meaning out of that data from experience, to think about it. And I want students to learn how to use that language to generate insight. I don't want them to see abstraction or ideas or the intellect as something that has no place in the creation of art. So how do I do this? I want my students to understand these two narrators, to go back to Eileen Pollock's distinction, the now narrator and the then narrator, the one who renders experience and then the one who attempts to understand it. And there are a whole range of journal prompts that I think move students towards the language that I'm talking about. Most common one I've used is, after they've written, say, a piece either a draft or exercise in which I've asked them to focus on a scene or description, a moment. I give them this prompt: what do I understand about this now that I didn't understand then is, and just to follow that sentence. Or, once I thought blank, but now I think blank. A sentence that they could repeat 6 or 7 times. In the effort to move them away from cultural commonplaces, conventional wisdom, cliches, I might give them a prompt like the third one. Part of the key of teaching essays that involve both story and reflection is helping students understand that they always begin with questions. That is related to subject matter. That students need to write about the things that they find puzzling. If they write about the things they've got already figured out, then they should write something other than an essay. And so the fourth bullet here, I'm constantly trying to get them to think about the power of questions and return to the questions that their narratives raise. And then finally I want to say something about other smaller exercises. Tense shifts are ways of shifting these two narrators back and forth, and I've often done exercises like this one. One of my favorites I've used over the years is to students. I encourage students to imagine a room they spent a lot of time in as a child. I ask them to put themselves back there and then draw on all their senses, describe what they're seeing in the present tense. And this tends to be richly detailed, fairly emotional. Present tense, as we all know, I think tends to increase the emotional intensity of the thing that students are writing. And then I'll stop them. This, of course, is a free write or a fast write. And I'll stop them, have them skip a line, and I'll have them shift into a more critical writing mode, crafting what they're saying rather than exploring, and begin with a prompt like, as I look back in this now, I realize that. And students, I think, understand when we talk about this, unpack this exercise, the difference between those two narrators. And we talk in some detail about what that difference is, what they detected, what their experience was when they moved from the first episode of writing to the second. Now, there's some other things I do, but I really don't want to go on and on about this, and I'm very anxious to answer whatever questions that you all may have. To end with, I just wanted to post my email address if you had some questions. I've got some handouts I can share if you're interested in those. And, of course, there's my URL for my website, which also has some materials. But I'm anxious to have a conversation about this, so I think that'd be a good time to close.
All right. Well, while we're kind of waiting for the questions, sometimes there's a little bit of a lag time before they show up. But I was going to ask you, I've heard you talk about the tense shift exercise in the context of freshman composition. Mm-hmm. I think, in fact, that workshop we did together last year in New Orleans. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about maybe some of the differences between how you might position an exercise like that in a composition classroom differently than maybe in a creative writing classroom.
Well, that's a great question, Amy, and I think the answer is I wouldn't. It's pretty much the same exercise. I
started thinking that as I asked the question. Yeah. I was like, oh, that's not. I bet I know the answer.
I think what happens is that the experience for the more experienced students, the creative writing students tend to be the more experienced students because they're generally more upper division classes or graduate classes. They tend to, it's a richer exercise for them. They tend to have much more to unpack and much more to talk about. They find it if it's helpful to them, they often just have a much richer conversation about it. But I do the same exercise in comp that I do in my MFA class as a way of illustrating these two narrators, and it's really not that much different, and the results are usually equally helpful.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Carrie McKinnon wanted to know if you would go back to that slide that had the tense shift exercise information on it.
Let me get rid of this thing here. Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
I think she's writing it down because
Oh,
then
okay.
she wrote to say thanks. So I think
Oh, you
she's
betcha.
transcribing that.
Yeah, this is an exercise that, as you know, Amy, I've kind of used around the country, and I think it's in one of the textbooks as well. But I really, obviously, the most helpful thing we can do to help students understand the difference in nonfiction between these two narrators is to have them experience what it feels like to be one narrator or the other. And this exercise does a great job with that. I think, I was thinking about the question that you just asked me a second ago. I think one of the things that experienced writers do is they make this move intuitively. A lot of my MFA students, for example, wouldn't say that the kind of work they do, say, in their journals or in their drafts is this shift between the now and the then narrator, between narration and exposition, but in fact they make it because they are intellectually engaged with the work in ways that my less experienced students aren't.
Yeah. Well, I was really struck in the workshop that you did last year, the way the students responded to this exercise, because it seems like a simple exercise, but then when you think about the way that students' lives are constructed right now, they're constantly living in the present. They're inundated, like even as they're sitting down in your classroom, they're probably sending and receiving text messages. They're constantly trying to interact with someone and something in this present moment, that even just being invited to reflect and to put themselves back in a past moment and then maybe bring that moment forward is probably not an experience that a lot of them have. So it's not only the intuition of the better writer, who's already kind of thinking in these ways, but these students really, many of them have never been encouraged to kind of resituate themselves in themselves, if that makes sense.
It does. You're right. It does make sense, and I think they find it a pretty powerful experience. And I think you're absolutely right that there aren't. We're so focused on. I think human beings typically are on what's right in front of us.
Sure.
Though I think it's more pronounced these days, and that essay writing really becomes an opportunity for students to not just tell stories of what happened to them, which in and of itself is a source of pleasure and meaning, but to apply what they know now to what they didn't know then, so that the things that they've experienced, they essentially get to experience twice. But the second time with new understanding. And then the thing that's so powerful about that, I think, particularly for less experienced writers, is that they learn that the point of writing anything like an essay is surprise, is to find out what you didn't know you knew. And the students who tend to write only in the now narrator often close off the opportunity for that kind of discovery.
Yeah. Kind of along a sort of similar lines, although it won't seem like that, and I'm not going to be able to make the connection, but trust me, in my mind there is a connection here. But I'm thinking about something like when you were talking about the patterns of reflection, and I liked that the visual of having the, where the patterns were illuminated, in the yellow text, so that the student could really see how that was working and what kind of balance maybe or not balance there was between reflection and dramatic narration. Have you ever had much success with getting students to kind of draw like an outline or a table where they sort of divide their work between the dramatic narrative and the narrative of thought, or does that seem to stymie them more than free them up?
No, I'm going to do it today in class.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, let me know how that goes.
Yeah, so here's what I did this with professional writing, but you can see this this graph here. So today in class, and when I have students in workshop and drafts, I'll ask them. I won't have them do this often, but at least once, I'll ask them to essentially do a graph like this, where they assign paragraph numbers to their draft, and then to chart this movement. And what they find is it may kind of look like this typical student narrative. And because we've looked at some published work, and I'll just pull up, in which the movement is much more dramatic and much more throughout the piece, they know that that they need to do more thinking about what they want to say in the piece. They need to be more reflecting on the story they're telling. And so this exercise, I think, becomes really helpful, and it's fun. They like doing it. They like looking at their own work the way that we look at the published work of professional writers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do it all the time.
Kind of a non-teacherly question, but I think something a lot of people think about. It seems like, nonfiction is, it's not just more all around us because of, our constant engagement with things like Facebook, but it's also out there more and more in, popular published works. And I was wondering, are you seeing that kind of that interest in nonfiction being as pronounced among like MFA students or undergraduate creative writing students, or are they following that kind of trend themselves?
They are, and actually I've noticed that. I know just from following the growth in the last 15 years of MFA programs that creative nonfiction programs around the country have grown and have become integral parts of programs, in some cases, that were exclusively fiction and poetry. But based on my personal experience here at BSU and I think I'll focus, talk particularly about undergraduate students. I've been amazed in the last 5 years how often when I talk to seniors, for example, about in my senior seminar about the creative writing work that they're interested in doing, or they enjoyed, or the genres that they care about most. I would say it used to always be fiction or poetry, and I'd say now it's evenly divided between fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction. So the growth and interest in our program has mirrored, I think, the rest of the country. And it's great because I teach those classes.
That does make it great.
Yeah.
Well, so do you think that's coming from, do you think that widespread interest and student interest are coming from the same source, or that student interest is being produced by the more widespread interest, or, where do you think that trend is coming from?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I can only speculate, but I think generally speaking, there's a tremendous amount of interest in creative writing at the undergraduate and graduate level. A very phenomenal growth in majors, and that includes here. Our writing emphasis major is the second largest major we have, and in the English department. And then I also think that our programs are responding by offering more courses, so students get the experience of looking at creative nonfiction genres, and in many cases they'd never really spent much time working with those genres or thinking about them. They didn't think literature included nonfiction, and then they realize it does, and some of them gravitate towards telling true stories. And then, of course, there's just the rise of the memoir, which is one of the most popular forms of literature these days. So I think it's a whole lot of things. It's a cocktail of reasons.
Cocktail of reasons.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. The idea of the cocktail.
All right. Yeah,
Not
cocktail's good. It's a
late
little
in the
early
day,
for
right?
me out here.
That's right, out in the West.
Yeah.
Well, hey, thanks so much, Bruce. It was great to talk to you again, and we'll forward you the many nice comments that we've had about your session today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you again for this opportunity.